That sound you hear is the gentle slurping of a cup of delicious coffee. Home brewed by none other than the man himself, Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Ben.
How's that coffee?
Much needed.
It is an afternoon on your day off.
It is.
And we are here for a long-form episode that we will try to keep to a reasonable length for you. It's a big one in our Westerns by the Decade series. It's called
The Wild Bunch.
The Popstorian Podcast with Chris and Ben.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
Greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market.
A date which will live in infamy.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Might have gotten away with it, too. If it wasn't for these blasted kids and their dog.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The evil of the thriller.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
Great power comes great responsibility.
Yes. So we've been doing Westerns by the Decade since we started this podcast. And in between our weekly minisodes, have longer form monthly episodes.
Or at least we try to. Anyway.
Yes.
So this is the 1960s film that we watched. And we watched it back in December. And then we took
Was it really?
It was the first week of December.
Okay.
And then we took a break for the holidays, busyness, all that good stuff.
Right.
So now we're getting back
Into the swing of things. In the saddle. There you
Yeah.
go. That's a much
You
more
s-
Western.
You see what I did there?
You plan that ahead.
Well, just because I play this out in my head like 5 times a day. Anyway,
So yeah, this is the Popstorian Podcast. I'm Ben, and that's Chris. And please be sure to subscribe. And if you like the show, tell a friend. We would love to have some more listeners out there. And grace your ears with our dulcet tones, as we do. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Chris does a great job keeping those up to date.
we have an Instagram and YouTube.
Yes.
And an
New-
email.
New YouTube video coming soon,
Oh, really?
I have to say.
You didn't tell me.
I'll just tease that on the podcast.
Okay.
That way it'll give me some motivation to finish it up.
Yes, we all need a little motivation.
Yes, hence the coffee.
Yes.
So yeah, we're out there. You can send us an email, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, and we will read them out on the show.
Westerns by the Decade.
Ben. Anyway, sorry. Trying to get back into the zone
Yeah,
for this episode.
it takes a minute.
Yeah,
We'll get into it once we start talking about the movie.
I imagine that's why you did the whole listen to us and
Yes.
where you can find us. Okay.
Also, I want people to listen to us and find us.
Well, yeah.
Call me crazy.
I think that's probably one of the big reasons we do this is so people will listen to us.
Yeah, and hopefully enjoy it.
Yeah, and learn to something,
Yeah,
a little education.
a little bit of knowledge.
But I've been really excited about this episode, actually,
Me too.
because when we watched this film, this is one of Ben's favorite Westerns.
It is.
Favorite movies, really, I think, at all time. If I'm
Yeah,
not
it's
mistaken.
in the list.
Yeah. And so last time we did Rio Bravo, which was one of my favorite Westerns, and Ben had never seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is one of your favorite Westerns, and I had never seen it before watching it for the first time with you, Ben,
Yeah.
for this podcast. So I've been very excited about talking about it and letting Ben know, because I didn't tell Ben exactly how I felt that night that we watched this movie.
Right.
So he's been kind of on edge this whole time about how does Chris feel about this movie, and what is he going to say about this
It's such
film?
an important movie to me. that I really needed to know your reaction. And we just had the experience where we watched Alien.
Yeah. Well, Alien's a different animal altogether.
It is a different animal altogether, but we had a major divergence of opinion there, and that was one of my favorite movies, and you liked it but weren't all that crazy about it. I think it's fair to say.
It's one of those, we're talking about Alien at the moment, is one of those movies that you think about and think, and it just grabs you even after you leave the theater. And days after we watched that together, I felt myself thinking about it and just like pondering it, like, well, it copies a lot from other sci-fi of the time.
It does, yeah.
But then you also think it stands up too. So what is the significance of this film? And I've found myself thinking, like, it's a horror film, and I've not watched a lot of horror films, so I was kind of thinking, well, what does this film do for the horror genre? I think it does more for the horror genre rather than the sci-fi one.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I didn't like the movie, Ben. It's just it's not my genre.
Yeah, that's
not
fair.
Expertise as much. But this movie, I found very interesting. I do have some critiques of it, and I think we'll talk about that maybe as we get into it. But overall, I did like the film. I can't say I unrestrained or unrestrictedly love the film. There's certain reasons for that. But it is a very good film, and I do see where a lot of people are writing that it's revolutionary and it's inventive, and what's the other word I'm looking for?
One of our primary sources that we used in the research for this podcast, which I had more time than usual to do over the holidays, was W.K. Stratton's new book, which came out for the 50th anniversary in 2019. That's called I think it's just called The Wild Bunch, isn't it? Or is it The Making of the Wild Bunch?
It's called The Wild Bunch. And I think the subtitle is like The Making of
it's kind of a
classic or something or other.
Yeah, making of book. He uses a lot of superlatives.
I'm afraid you made it through the book, and I did not make it through the book. I just got bogged down.
Peckinpah scholarship in general uses a lot of superlatives.
Okay.
It's all very sort of. I discovered this in my research. It's very hagiographic. People who love Peckinpah want to elevate him to this status of he's the greatest director of all time, and we love him, and he can do no wrong for us. So there's this kind of like reverenced awe about the Wild Bunch in particular. I think it had a very very large impact. I think it's fair to say
it's considered his best film, isn't it?
Usually, yeah. It's almost always at the top of the list. I think it's on the AFI 100 as well, although I couldn't tell you what position it holds currently.
Is it?
I'm pretty sure it is. It might even be in the top 25, Chris.
Well, I'm going to Google that now.
Should I do, while you're doing that, should I do a summary?
Yes, please, Ben. I think you should do the summary since it has been a while since I actually watched the film, and you've seen it a few times, if I'm not mistaken.
So the Wild Bunch opens with a group of soldiers walking into a bank, and we realize they ride past a group of children that are torturing scorpions by throwing them into a colony of fire ants. And as they ride past this group, they help an old lady across the street, and then they go into the bank and pull out their guns and start robbing the bank. The leader cries out, "If they move, kill them!" And then there's a big screen that says, directed by Sam Peckinpah. That particular moment, we find out that this is the Wild Bunch in question, a group of outlaws led by William Holden's character Pike. And they rob. As they're robbing the bank, they discover that the railroad, who has a lot of money invested in the bank, has set this up as a trap, and there's a group of snipers, if you want to call them that, bounty hunters, on the roof of the building across the street. But fortuitously, I guess you could say, there's a temperance union parade, and the villains, or I guess the anti-heroes, Pike and his gang, use the temperance union as cover to escape from the bank where they are pinned down by the bounty hunter fire. So right away you see that this bunch is indeed wild and kind of ruthless. They don't care about the innocent bystanders. They're just concerned with robbing the bank and getting away. But also the railroad is kind of a little bit ruthless too. They kill just as many of the innocent townspeople as the outlaws do. At this point, we're kind of introduced to Robert Ryan. Is that his name?
Yeah.
I'm blanking.
The Thornton. That's his
Thornton.
name.
Deke Thornton.
Yeah.
Robert Ryan's character, Deke Thornton, who was a former member of the gang, we're kind of led to understand. And he's on parole, and part of his assignment is to catch the Wild Bunch, his old gang. So he's kind of assigned to give chase, and they are riding off with the money. One of their gang gets left behind and killed, and another is fatally injured and then later killed by the leader. They take their loot back to their corral where they're hiding out, I guess, and there's an old man who's part of their gang watching the horses.
Played by Edmund O'Brien.
Yes. Excellent performance. I guess I should introduce the actors playing the gang at this point. There's your Warren Oates and your Ben Johnson, who are part of the Peck and Paw stock company. Fantastic. Playing two brothers, the Gorch brothers. Then you've got your old man and your leader, William Holden, and then his sidekick is Dutch, played by Ernest Borgnine, in one of, I think, his better roles. Wouldn't you agree?
I would say his most famous roles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably call it probably his top five.
Definitely up there. I haven't seen the movie that he won the Oscar for, which was Marty.
I've never seen Marty either.
That's
a shortcoming in our part.
On my list after seeing this. But yeah, they get back and they open the bags of gold that they think are gold, and they turn out to be silver washers.
They're not silver. They're
yes,
pig iron, cast iron. Well,
just plain old washers.
Yeah.
And this, of course, leads to disappointment and frustration, but eventually to hilarity as they start to see the funny side of it.
I think.
I skipped over one of the gang members.
You're forgetting someone.
A very important gang member.
Yes.
Jamie Sanchez's character, Angel.
Yes.
Angel is Mexican, from Mexico. The rest of the group are white, Caucasian.
They're all white, yeah.
And I guess he's kind of the young one of the group, too. The others are all kind of middle-aged or older.
Yeah, he's much younger than the others. He seems to kind of come from this revolutionary Mexico, while the others seem to be much more, I guess, much more the Civil War generation that came from the Americas.
So realizing that they have no cash resources from this costly holdup, they cross the Rio Grande and head for Angel's Village. And it's in Angel's Village that they formulate their next strategy, which I believe was to go to the general that kind of rules that province, because they hear that he needs some work done. But this general also raided the village, kidnapped Angel's wife, and in general caused a lot of havoc. So there's a lot of history that goes into this movie, a lot of backstory on the Mexican Revolution.
Yes.
If you want to touch on any of that at any point, feel free.
It's
not the decade that we're talking about.
I've not been a big scholar into it, although there is a great podcast out there called Revolutions.
Yes.
That I listen to, and they have, I think it's like a 20-part series on the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah.
So I recommend that.
So check out anything of that for a thorough explanation.
And also Stratton's book covers a little bit of it.
Stratton's book covers a little bit of it.
Yeah.
But the basic idea is that this general's in power under the kind of regime in place. Pancho Villa is a contemporary of these events. And the general's not very well liked, of course, because he's doing these raids.
General Mapache.
But they decide to go to him anyway and see if they can get some work. So they leave the village in kind of a, I don't know what you would call it. It's a processional. The villagers sing to them and hand them flowers, and it's almost a funereal kind of atmosphere.
Farewell.
It's a very somber farewell after a short stay.
Which I think that's an interesting picture, considering they barely know these guys, and they're like, well, we had a good party last night, so
yes,
so long, and hope all goes well.
In Mapache's encampment, I guess you could say, it's a little bit more permanent than that, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a permanent structure. It's sort of ramshackle and falling down, but he's enforced it with a ton of troops. So the gang enter and behave somewhat peacefully, but they're kind of concerned because they're surrounded by all these troops.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a tense situation from the get-go. Ernest Borgnine makes an interesting comment on the difference between them, the outlaws, and the soldiers. He goes, well, at least we don't hang nobody. So there's kind of that juxtaposition of the different kinds of evil that they've perpetrated, our anti-heroes and the Mexican troops. So they're in this tense situation, and when Angel spies his wife, and they have a conversation in Spanish, which is not subtitled, but you get very much, I think, the idea of what's going on. She's decided that she wants to stay with the general. She wants to be with the general, perhaps because it makes her feel safe. So she basically betrays Angel in favor of the more powerful general. And she goes to the general and starts kissing him and displaying her affection. And this enrages Angel, who draws his firearm in the midst of this large group of potentially hostile soldiers and shoots his former wife through the heart as she sits on the general's chest, or general's lap.
You can imagine this endears our anti-heroes.
Yes.
To all the general's men.
They're quite peeved. Guns are drawn, but nobody is injured except for the woman who's shot. And the general, once some conversation has been had and tempers cool a little bit, everybody breathes a sigh of relief, and the general kind of agrees to take these men back and discuss his plan, this job that he wants them to do. So he takes them back, and they stay and carouse in his care. They have some wine and some food, and they meet the German generals who are kind of assisting him.
Yeah, this is taking place in 1917, I think. Is right before the U.S. enters World War I.
Yes.
And this is, I guess, it's on a historical note, kind of playing into the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany's talking to Mexico, trying to get them into the war. So they're talking to Mexico, thinking, well, we can open up another front in the United States.
Yes, and also introducing some technology, like an automobile for the general.
So they're kind of wooing. You kind of see the Germans wooing the Mexican government at that time.
So Mapache's army needs some more firearms, and they found out through their spies that a shipment of firearms is traveling through a certain route in the southwestern United States, just over the border, and they want the Wild Bunch to steal said firearms. And Pike eventually agrees to go along with this, and he negotiates to get Angel back because Angel was obviously imprisoned for his act of violence.
Right. Although he accompanies them on the raid.
He does. So they manage to negotiate and get him to rejoin their gang, and they're given pretty much autonomy. They don't have anybody sent with them to make sure that they
do it right.
It right. They're allowed to go and do the job. Anything else important I need to cover from that scene? I don't think so.
Not really. I mean, they pull it off, it actually works out quite nicely. They get the guns.
Mm-hmm.
They escape.
There is an important point about that.
A posse,
yeah, there was a posse waiting for them on the train,
which is also headed by Thornton, who kind of guesses where they're going to hit next.
He has all the bounty hunters, and then there's also a troop,
a contingent of troops,
a contingent of very
young
and inefficient troops.
Well, untrained, really. They're barely considered soldiers, kind of thing.
Very raw recruits.
And I think that's why you look at Thornton's face in the scene. You kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to bring them.
Yeah. So it kind of begs the question: how much did the railroad know that the Wild Bunch were going to do this job? How much did they know about Mapache? Did they leak the knowledge that the guns were going to be on this particular shipping lane?
I guess
in order to set another trap.
I guess they're not very specific,
but they don't explain the details.
The only scene I can remember is that Thornton guesses. It seems like Thornton kind of knows what's going to happen there, and he just guesses that would be the next move that they would make.
I have to say it's a pretty spectacular robbery sequence.
It is
of events. The train stops for at a water tower, and the gang silently, basically, creep on board, detach the passenger cars, which involves backing the train up very slowly in a very short distance, detach the passenger cars, and then take off with the guns. Then unload the guns into a wagon further down the track as the posse is pursuing them.
And then they blow the bridge.
Yes. I was going to say they sent the train into reverse and
destroyed
destroyed the passenger car.
I forgot about that part. They do that.
But then they head for the border, and there's a bridge across the Rio Grande into Mexico.
Which sets up a really great special effects scene.
Yes. Yeah. And then they set dynamite to the bridge, which explodes just as Thornton has his sights on Pike, our hero, William Holden's character. Oh. So yes, a rather spectacular stunt. Indeed, one of the most lauded in the film industry. I would say.
I can imagine.
So they have the guns, but Angel, whose village was raided, wants to give some of the guns to the Mexican revolutionaries who he supports.
He basically negotiated with Ernest Borgnine and Holden's character before the deal goes down, and so they kind of know he's getting a case of rifles, but they don't realize when. So they kind of get robbed right across the border.
They do, yeah. Thornton survives the explosion of the bridge. He continues to pursue them with the bounty hunters. I keep saying the bounty hunters. It's not very specific, but it's Strother Martin and L.Q. Jones.
There's a couple other guys who survive too.
Uh-huh.
They're not really the sharpest tools in the shed.
They're not. They start shooting at the army in their befuddlement.
Yeah.
Thornton continually laments the ineptitude of his crew. But yes, so they have to play it very cool to keep Pike and his crew have to keep it very cool to prevent the Mexicans or the Mexican army rather, from stealing their the firearms and killing them in the process without paying them for their. In other words, they're very worried about a double cross, and it seems we're led to believe that this is a legitimate fear. So they load the wagon with the rifles and they strap dynamite to it. Then they're ambushed in a canyon, but they threaten to light the fuses and blow up the guns, and that's
seems enough to.
That's labeled a smart move by the general's assistant.
Yeah,
lieutenant, I guess I should say.
Seems to be like third in command or something.
Something like that. Yeah. He's rather spectacular performance.
I forget the actor's name who does it, but
I was reading. Great old character actor, been in a lot of movies.
Yeah, I was reading about him. I think he was trying to play the part like the bandits from Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Yeah, there's a lot of Treasure of Sierra Madre influence throughout here. If you've seen that film, spoilers alert.
So
sorry, we need to get our permanent spoiler warning.
We do, yeah. It's another great Western. We should probably.
Yeah,
that would have been
we should
good.
talk about that.
Talk about that one.
Even hearkening back to the Washers, there's kind of a parallel there with a scene in Treasure of Sierra Madre.
Anyway,
But yes, they start delivering the rifles in a roundabout way. They hide the rifles and tell them where they're buried, like one case at a time, and take their payments. And they're in the process of doing this. Things are going well. There's a few flashbacks that tell us more about Thornton's relationship with Pike. Pike actually lost him due to incompetence. Thornton was captured due to Pike's incompetence. So Pike carries a lot of guilt about that, and Thornton carries a lot of bitterness. But yes, as the final delivery arrangements are made, Dutch and Angel ride into the camp, and the General Mapache knows that Angel has absconded with one of the cases of rifles for himself.
and so they take him.
And Dutch doesn't do anything to stop them, rides off on his way. And he, during the train robbery, Angel actually saves Dutch. Dutch was falling to his demise under the wheels of the train, and Angel grabs him and pulls him out. So there's kind of this pre-existing relationship there.
Well, there's a relationship with all of these guys.
Yeah, it's very interwoven, and
So
they're all very interesting characters to me. But yeah, the general has all the rifles except for that case that was stolen, and he has a machine gun that wasn't supposed to be part of the shipment, but they gave it to the general anyway. There's a terrifying yet hilarious scene where they try to operate it without putting it on a tripod.
yeah, the German guy is like, it needs a tripod.
And it goes on for a while too, like scenes of them shooting up their own encampment.
Yeah.
Friendly fire.
He apparently masters it fairly well, though.
Eventually, they do get the hang of it. So, yeah, the Wild Bunch is paid, but one of their own has been taken, and they ride kind of into town, I guess, to get some whiskey and women.
That's true.
And they see Angels being tortured, dragged behind the car.
There's a kind of an important scene there where Pike tries to buy Angel back
Yes.
at that point, and you can see kind of eating at him that Angel got captured again, and the general won't do it. He won't give up his prize or his prisoner, and so they go. I guess you could call it a whorehouse.
Pretty much.
Yeah, and they try to forget their fallen comrade.
Although Dutch does not partake.
He doesn't. He sits outside and just kind of whittles
Mm-hmm.
a little wooden knife or something.
Yeah.
You can definitely tell he's brooding.
But there's a great scene where Pike is kind of, it's post-coital, I guess you would say. Pike is sitting there, drinking the last of his whiskey, and he's come to the bottom of the bottle. And there's no dialogue in this scene between him and the Mexican lady that he's been with, but there's kind of a sense of longing, I guess you could say, in both of them for maybe a different life or a different chance that Pike, I guess, recognizes he might not have since he's being pursued on every side. And it's kind of a moment of decision for him. And then he turns to the rest of the gang and says, "Let's go," which is kind of his catchphrase. He says that a lot whenever they move from one story point to another.
And Warren Oates' character here, he's one of the Gorch brothers, kind of says, "Why not?"
Yeah, and it's one of the great Warren Oates moments from this movie. So they step out.
It's a very famous, probably the most famous scene of the movie.
Yes, they grab their weapons and they just start walking. And there's an excellent musical accompaniment. I love the score by Jerry Fielding.
Jerry Fielding. I thought I thought they actually had a performer, somebody that Peckinpah knew from Mexico, for actually perform the guitar on this.
Yeah, they did. In addition to, I think Fielding was the composer, and then
he had this.
But there's also a lot of traditional Mexican folk music in it, so he was responsible for that.
And I'm glad you brought up the score, because I find the score interesting because it's not very loud or flashy. It's kind of one of those things that just plays alongside it, and you just kind of ride it.
Yeah.
You don't notice it that much.
There's not a catchy Magnificent Seven type
It's not
theme
Magnificent
song.
Seven. It's not. It's not A Few Dollars More or Good, Bad, the Ugly. That kind of bold music score.
Yeah.
It's really just kind of soft along. It's
Simple
not a
and
ballad.
subtle. Yeah.
It's not so many other films that you've seen in the past. Like High Noon has this catchy ballad. And, even Rio Bravo has its own ballad.
Yep.
Played by like very famous performers. It just kind of just stays there. That is one of the things I noticed while watching the film, and
It left you wanting?
well, it was not what I was kind of hoping for, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I didn't hate it either. It was just kind of like, okay, it's a little bit different. It's not like your regular action film kind of music to it. It's kind of juxtaposition. Yes, that's the word. Where you have like soft music to a very violent movie.
Yeah.
And they continue walking on, and they end up in the general's hacienda.
In the center of the enemy's camp. And Pike, the general's crew have been celebrating, so they're somewhat hungover, possibly still drunk. There's a lot of carousing going on, and the general kind of staggers to his feet, says, "What do you want? I thought we got rid of you." And I should note that the general is played by Emilio Fernandez, I want to say, who's a great Mexican director in his own right. Directed several classic movies from the golden age of Mexican cinema. But they insist that Pike's gang insists that they want Angel back. So the general grabs Angel and says, "Here, I'll give him to you." And he cuts his bonds.
His bonds on his hands.
And then he cuts his throat. And when he cuts Angel's throat, the gang open fire and kill him. And then there's a moment of kind of stunned silence where they're all standing there back to back in the middle of this crew, and everyone's shocked that they actually killed the general, who kind of seemed immortal up to this point, because there's a brief scene where the general is raided by Pancho Villa, and there's bullets flying around him, but the general just stands there in the middle of it. So he has kind of an immortal vibe about him, and a woman's shot literally off his lap. So there's this stunned silence that the general was killed, but nobody makes a move to subdue the outlaws. They just kind of stand there afraid. And there's a sense that they might have gotten away with this. They might be able to escape, and they kind of laugh at their luck. And then Pike, angrily, out of some unspoken emotion, shoots the German general. And this sparks a very bloody, very elaborate, very intense final fight scene.
This is probably one of the greatest movie climaxes ever.
It's the model for the action movie showdown climax sequence.
Yeah.
It definitely has a tremendous emotional impact, but just a visceral, physical response as well. There's a lot of fast cutting and slow motion, and which is one of Peckinpah's
calling cards. He does
calling
this
cards
in other parts of the film as well. Whenever there's a gunfight, there's always slow motion and then quick cuts.
But this is kind of the ultimate fulfillment of that.
It is.
So even though there's only 4 members of the gang at this point, the old man having been lost in the desert, they managed to slaughter most of Mapache's men, but lose their own lives in the process. So there's no survivors of the Wild Bunch. The final man to fall, or the final men to fall, I guess I should say, is Dutch and Pike. They fall at the same time.
I think Pike dies a little sooner because Dutch sees him go down.
Yes.
And Dutch makes his final final move. Ernest Borgnoid's most famous death scene, I guess, in his career, and he's just dying. He says, "Pike, Pike." He says it like 3 or 4 times in this film. Which
give him hell, Pike.
I just think that's a very interesting part of that.
It's a chilling scene,
and it just makes me interested in Dutch's character. Like he would follow Pike through hell. I guess he did Bill, but anyway, but he's such devotion to Pike, and it's just, I don't know if they really dug into that as much as they could have.
There's a lot left there unexplored.
Yeah, there is.
It's very interesting. I think it's also important to note in this scene that the kind of the final the blows that really cripple Pike are delivered by a woman first, who he doesn't shoot. He spares her, and then she turns around and picks up a gun and shoots him in the back. And then, of course, he kills her before he dies. And then the final killing blow is delivered by a child, like a messenger boy, who has picked up a gun in the midst of the firefight. And
but if I'm not mistaken, that's the same messenger boy that gives the message to Mapache.
I heard conflicting stories on that. I thought it was the same.
Okay.
But one source that I read said that it was not. It's interesting. So
it
was an older source, so it's possible they didn't. I mean, obviously, when it was written, it was, I think, 1979. This book came out, Sam Peckinpah by Doug Kinney. When that book came out, there wasn't a means to rewatch it on home video.
Right.
So it's possible that it is the same, but I can't confirm that it is or isn't. In any case, it's meant to represent the same thing.
Right.
So that at this point, after pretty much everybody has died, Thornton and his gang of bounty hunters come back, and Thornton finds the dead corpses of the men he was sent to capture.
And he takes Pike's gun.
He does. Pike's 6-shooter, which stayed in the holster. Pike having used a 9mm for most of the firefight. So Thornton catches up to them. The bounty hunters take the corpses. L.Q. Jones and Strother Martin's wonderful comedic relief characters.
Very dark humor.
Very dark humor.
Very dark humor.
They take the corpses and head off, and Thornton declines to join them. And they say, "Well, these corpses are going to start rotting. Don't you want to come and get your reward?" And he says no. So he stays down in Mexico. And a little while later, we hear gunshots in the distance, and it's kind of strongly implied, if not confirmed, that although it happens off screen, that our bounty hunters were killed and ambushed by the locals.
And not just the locals, but our old man friend, Edmund O'Brien.
Yes, he survived his stay in the desert and joined up with Pancho Villa and the revolutionaries. And he invites Thornton to do the same.
And Thornton takes him up on it.
And they ride away with the final closing line. "It ain't like it used to be, but it'll do."
And they literally ride into the sunset at the end of this film.
They do. And then they transition nicely into some footage from the procession that they had before.
So
that's the conclusion of The Wild Bunch.
This film I really liked because as I'm watching this film, I am reminded of movies that will be made in the future. And I think you touched on it a little earlier when you were talking about the plot of the film, is that this is a kind of a template for future action films. This is a proto-action film, if you will. And that's kind of one of the things I thought was really cool about watching this film, is that revolutionary, maybe not, but it's definitely plays a huge impact for future films.
Yeah.
And future westerns, because I was reminded of, actually, of all movies, Transformers, while watching this movie, because of the quick cuts and how fast the action sequences are. I remember watching Transformers, which has nothing to do with westerns, but how fast the action sequences are in that film.
Yeah.
And you kind of see, that has its roots back to even to The Wild Bunch in 1969.
At the time, it was the movie that it had more cuts in it, like physical cuts, than any other movie made before it.
Yeah.
Documented. There might have been some other films that aren't documented.
It also reminded me of course, Quentin Tarantino.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Takes a lot of influence there.
I imagine that he had to been influenced at some point. There's just so much blood and shooting going on in movies like Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight, and those kind of films that he does.
That's one of the things that this movie was a big splash about. This movie when it came out was the violence.
It's very violent.
There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of blood.
And when I was reading up on it, trying to catch up for the film, I was like, oh, well, this is not that violent. But then I remembered this is 1969.
Yeah.
And I'm watching movies from the 2000s. So this is very violent.
The standards have changed, but for the time it was considered very violent.
It is.
It's interesting now that's not so much a big part of the conversation surrounding the movie as it used to be.
So the things that I don't like about the movie. Are you ready?
As I'll ever be. What didn't Chris like about the movie? What will Ben say? Will they survive this rift in their friendship? Tune in next time to part 2 of The Wild Bunch.
Thanks for listening to the Popstorian podcast. Be sure to subscribe. You can find us online at popstorian.com or on Facebook and Twitter. Tune in next time for more of the history of popular culture.